Last time I did a video like this, it was in reaction to my local track AJC Speedway closing down. However, this time it's more in reaction to another track close to me opening up called the Barn RC Raceway down in Barnesville, Georgia. There are many different ideas that people have when it comes to what they think will grow the hobby as a whole, and in this video I'm going to add my own opinion to the fire now that I have more experience as a racer. Before we begin, I'd like to thank my sponsors, starting with A-Main Hobbies. Anything you guys buy using the links in the description below will directly support me as well. Also, I'd like to thank Raceline Designs for sponsoring last video. Anything you guys use by using the code ROACHRC all caps at racelinedesigns.com will directly support me as well. With that out of the way, let's get started. Before we begin, I'd like to preface this by saying that this is a racing channel, and as such we'll be talking about racing or RC racing in most of its forms. So before we get into the more popular forms of RC racing, or at least the most visible, let's talk about a more niche version of RC racing. On-road and its popularity really depends entirely where you happen to live for the most part, and I'll be honest, on-road could be considered a niche within a niche. RC racing as a whole is not as big as people like to think it is, and for the most part it could be considered a niche market. On-road is an even more niche part of the hobby, and for the most part it just isn't as appealing to get into at first glance. This is sort of reflected in the people who do on-road RC racing as a whole. It's very much an older man's game, at least here in the States. Partially this is because there aren't really many specific on-road tracks compared to off-road, but also because off-road is usually more fun to watch and easier to advertise. It's more fun watching big 8-skill buggies revving up to 40k RPM during a big track than to watch tiny different colored blurs go around a small carpet or parking lot track. With that being said, there are some places where it would seem that on-road as a whole is doing quite well. A good example would be in the UK. I'm going to reference the UK a few times in this video because at the very least when it comes to doing RC right, they seem to have their stuff sorted out. Going back to on-road again, I think the reason why it's doing quite well in the UK compared to the US is, well, rules, oddly enough. What I mean by that is, the classes that are pushed to new people are very accessible to newcomers in the hobby, both from people just getting into the hobby as a whole, or people who may be into modeling and collecting Tamiya cars. Tamiya is a very big player in the world of not just RC, but hobbies full stop. From miniature painting, collecting, and of course, modeled cars. And the best part about those model RC cars? They're hella cheap. If you wanted to get into Euro truck racing right now, the cost of literally everything needed to run the car, including a charger, transmitter, receiver, and a LiPo battery, would be roughly the same as the price of a new Schumacher LD3. Not only that, but going back to the rules I mentioned before, there aren't too many things you're allowed to change on the car from box stock, specifically relating to tires and power. Now I'm not going to get too into detail as what you're allowed to change and what you're not allowed to change, as that's another video for the future, and I'm talking far distant future. What I will say is that the mods you're allowed to do are to encourage new racers to make modifications to their cars without feeling discouraged about not making enough changes to keep up with the really fast people who drop dummy money into their cars, like the stock class is here. Of course, there are those type of people who bend the rules as much as they can get to an advantage, but hey, that's racing, right? On a global scale, however, on-road doesn't seem to be as healthy as it could be compared to other forms of RC racing. As for what I would change on a club level here in places like the US where on-road isn't as big, well, I like the idea of renting out sports centers and convention centers for on-road races or even carpet off-road races. I know of a few different convention centers here in Atlanta that would be perfect for that kind of thing. Unfortunately, I don't have the disposable income to put in a weekend event like that on. Yet. Also, pushing accessible and cheap classes instead of classes that at a minimum cost something like this is another great way to get people invested. For off-road, it would seem as though we have a very different set of problems to solve. So let's move on from on-road and talk a bit about off-road. I'm going to split this section up into two different sections, that being 10th scale and 8th scale. So let's talk about 10th scale first. 10th scale has been around forever in terms of RC racing as a whole, and during that time it has evolved a lot in terms of, well, everything. From how the buggies are built to the surfaces we race on, everything has changed since the early days of RC10s and Ultimas. I normally would talk about the cars and tracks that have evolved separately over time, but they really go hand in hand. I already did a video about the evolution of tracks, so if you'd like to, you can watch that video and come back to this one. But the long short of it goes something like this. Early tracks are farm dirt style tracks that are extremely loamy and such. Drivers want a more consistent surface to drive on, so the dirt gets harder and smoother over time. Buggies being designed now reflect those surfaces. Repeat this cycle until you get to today. Some people like this change and enjoy running on high grip dirt, carpet, or AstroTurf, and others absolutely despise it. But here's the thing, and yes, I know this is anecdotal evidence, but I haven't really seen anyone leave the racing scene due to the track becoming too groomed. Of course, people have their preferences, but for the most part, I've never seen someone leave the track because they put calcium on it or something like that. Again, going back to the UK, RC, specifically off-road, is doing quite well. Of course, they don't get everything right. I mean, come on, you're not allowed to clap during a race. But for the most part, the clubs are doing decently. I think this is partially due to the fact that, like I mentioned before in the on-road section, and the UK, and by extension the rest of Europe, treat RC racing more like clubs rather than businesses. There are a few benefits to this, most related to taxes and such, but also because of how everything is run. Remember how I mentioned how lots of different clubs in the UK and Europe run out sports centers and malls and hotels? Well, the point of this whole section of the UK and Europe is how they do things in 10 scale is the fact that they are able to do this for very little compared to America because of the modular track system. You see, running a track that has a dirt as a surface can be both an expensive and back-breaking affair. However, with carpet, you can pretty much just lay down a base set of carpet or AstroTurf, set up a few different pre-built jumps on it, and go from there in terms of layout. Change the piping or walls around and move some jumps, and there you go, you've got a new layout. And once everything is done for the weekend, you can pull it up and go home and repeat it for the next weekend. Think of it like how 8-scale big races do it in America, but on carpet and on a much smaller scale. Now, why exactly am I talking about this? Well, because I think this is probably going to be the future of off-road racing in the 10-scale space here in America, unless something drastically changes, permanent hobby shops become a lot more profitable, and indoor tracks as a whole become a lot more popular. Before we move on to 8-scale though, I want to touch on outdoor 10-scale racing for a bit. Back in the early 2000s and 2010s, outdoor tracks were still pretty popular, and for the most part there were big races taking place at outdoor facilities, specifically for 10-scale. Think something like the Cactus Classic. However, these days very few if any 10-scale outdoor tracks even exist outside of Florida, and in terms of big 10-scale outdoor races, well, there just aren't any. With the only exception this year will be the Gas Truck Nats in Idaho run by Adam Drake with a specifically tailored 10-scale outdoor track in July. As for the direction manufacturers are going to take in the future, it's hard to say. The B7 from AE seems to be very much a carpet car through and through, but Schumacher is trying to go in the opposite direction, or at least keeping options open with the LD3D and LD3M. With the off-road IFMAR 10-scale championships taking place in Australia in 2025 on an outdoor track, we'll see if any manufacturers want to pivot around to lower grip designs. When it comes to 8-scale racing, there's pretty much only one surface type you're going to get, and that's going to be dirt in any way you can mess with it. You've got loose dirt, hard packed dirt, grooved dirt, mixed surface dirt, treated dirt, and everything in between. There are some AstroTurf tracks in places like the UK and, well, the UK, but mainly dirt is the primary surface run for 8-scale. Because of this acceptance of really any type of dirt, and because 8-scale cars are more resilient to punishment compared to 10-scale, 8-scale tends to be a lot more versatile. Also, primarily 8-scale RC racing is also done outdoors. This is good for track owners, as instead of running an indoor facility and having to run a hobby shop to sustain it, or run a carpet to reduce track costs and maintenance, outdoor tracks are differently maintained. Yes, they still need upkeep and such, and the cost of running an outdoor dirt track tends to be less than an indoor dirt track. Because of this and the previous reasons I mentioned before, 8-scale is probably the most popular and well-funded part of the hobby as a whole in the modern RC racing world. Even still, RC racing is nowhere near the level of popularity that most hobbyists would want it to be, even 8-scale. There are some reasons for this, but I think one thing that a lot of people overlook is the cost of entry compared to other hobbies as a whole. Take for example, gaming. Now, when I say cost of entry, I'm not entirely talking about money. If you look at the average cost someone puts into their gaming PC, you'd be surprised how much the cost compared to an 8-scale buggy can be. What I mean is the time cost or time commitment. Gaming doesn't require a lot of time commitment compared to RC racing, or at least most games don't. I can load up a game of Destiny 2 and complete a game of Crucible in about 10 minutes at most after work, or I can complete a Nightfall in about 10 to 20 minutes. I can also do this pretty much anytime I'm home. Be it a weekend, weekday, doesn't really matter, it's ready and available. RC isn't like this at all. Pretty much the only time you get to run if you're far away from a track is on the weekends or dedicated practice days and nights. Even if you do happen to live close to a track like, for example, Beachline RC in Cocoa, Florida, that is open multiple times a week, you're usually at work during the day and want to relax at home during the night, spending time with your family and whatnot. The best way it would seem to help people get into the racing scene would be to gain as many people who are bashing into racing as possible, but even then this can be a fine line to tread. Imagine, if you will, you're a new person to RC, or you've been bashing for a while and want to check out the track close to you. You know absolutely nothing about racing and probably no one at the track either. You put down your Traxxas, Arma, or even HPI on the track and you struggle hard. You ask for advice to get a few different answers, but it would seem like everyone is steering you in the direction of getting a whole new RC racing car that's more expensive than what you have, and you have to build it from the ground up, something you've never done before. It's at this point where we see lots of people turned away from racing due to the sheer commitment needed to run it. This is where we as racers need to step up and do what we can to make that transition as clean and trouble-free as possible. Here are some ways I think we can do that. The first step is letting someone who hasn't run before get an idea of what a race-tuned vehicle actually feels like. Allowing someone to try your car on a practice day for a lap or two helps in a lot of ways. It shows that the environment they're looking to get into and spend time in is friendly and welcoming. It also shows you that you as a person are willing to teach someone who doesn't really have the best grasp on how to drive. And remember, these cars are meant to be run, and if they break, they can be fixed. So if something does break, or even they just crash, don't give them a hard time about it. Things happen and they're learning. Another good way to make racing more appealing would be, in my opinion, to make it a little bit easier, specifically track-wise. I don't mean entirely for big races like Masters of Dirt, Clash of Champions, or any big race time events. I mean on a smaller club level. I usually don't talk too much about track layouts and such because I know how much goes into making them. But I'll make an exception just this once. Let's face it, when running any type of track, it isn't too fun to constantly crash and have to be marshaled, and doing it over and over again on a really difficult track isn't really fun either. Having a track that is more beginner friendly that can cater to lower skilled drivers driving lower powered vehicles will encourage and motivate newcomers looking to just get their feet wet, better than having a really technical track that's difficult to get around but caters to pro drivers. Like I said before, this doesn't really mean you have to do this for big events too. Just club level stuff where you're more likely to see people who aren't as good at driving. The future as a whole is hard to pin down. For things like on-road, it's hard to say whether or not it will continue to evolve in any meaningful way, or be relegated to a fun side part of RC much like drifting is. 10-scale off-road is at a crossroads between running even higher gripped carpet tracks in the future or going back to the past with outdoor tracks at a club level. Whichever one catches on more will probably be cemented this year. As for 8th scale, things need to be looking up on the surface, especially with the recent race coverage going on for larger 8th scale races, but there will always be still room for improvement. On the other side of the pond, it would seem as though RC is much of the same if a bit healthier than it is here. So if you happen to live there, upside down, or across the even bigger pond, be sure to let me know how you think RC is doing in your area. Also, if you got this far in the video, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more. If you'd like to support me even more, you can subscribe to my Patreon, where I post updates and teasers as to when my next videos are going to come out. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank my active patrons Michael Williams, RC World Discord server, Casey Nix, Ben Reeves, Dave Armstrong, Joe Jenkins, Rob Bedingfield, Caden Merks, Ian Petrie, and especially Buddy Howell and Morrison Watt. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.